3 cops laughed like hyenas as they cuffed her, a black woman in full military uniform whose only crime was pulling out her phone to record the truth. They thought she was weak. They thought her skin and gender gave them a free pass to abuse. But in just 7 seconds, one call straight to the Pentagon, their careers vanished, like tear gas blown off a training field. Badges dropped, reputations torched, honor buried and forgotten. What state are you in? Where you live? Is silence just a habit, or is it the sentence for cowards? The suburban supermarket parking lot in North Carolina at 11:05 a.m. was eerily still, the air heavy under a scorching midweek sun that slurred colors into a monotone haze. The asphalt, bleached in places by tire tracks and old oil stains, seemed to pulse beneath the heat. Against this backdrop, a deep black SUV slipped into a parking space at the very edge of the last row, the tires crunching softly on the gravel lining. With a faint metallic sigh, the rear door swung open, its hinge emitting a brittle whisper that cut through the silence. The woman emerged with a deliberate, unhurried grace, her posture upright, her steps measured, as though she were descending onto a different terrain, one harder, colder, more exacting. Her dark skin caught the harsh sunlight without flinch, her features unreadable behind an expression of quiet resolve. She did not scan her surroundings for no parking signs or curious onlookers. Instead, she simply tugged the sleeve of her dark gray jacket down over her wrist, squared her shoulders, and lifted the hatch. A short distance away, 2 uniformed officers stood beneath the sparse shade of a lone oak at the lot's fringe, absorbed in filling out ticket books. One officer tapped his pen rhythmically against the notebook's edge, the click echoing like a metronome in the still air. Sergeant Lowell was the first to notice the woman. He let out an almost flirtatious whistle and narrowed his eyes, the look in them thick with disdain, the familiar mask worn by those who believe themselves entitled to judge. "Yet another cosplay weekend warrior," he muttered, lacing his words with bored contempt as though choosing a sandwich at a deli. Privileged types flaunting faux military garb to intimidate the simple folks. His voice held the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to dismissing anyone who diverged from his narrow sense of normal. Deputy Dean, marginally shorter but vocally more insistent, compensating for a deputy title few remembered, chortled at Lowell's side. He followed the woman's slow, deliberate movements with a mocking leer. "Think those fatigues make her immune to traffic laws?" he jeered, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. A young couple exiting the supermarket paused mid-step, diverting their path to avoid the scene, their eyes wide with apprehension. Dean seized the moment to elaborate. One ticket for illegal parking, another for indecent attire. Nothing like a little cosplay to spice up a parking lot. Lowell chuckled darkly, inscribed a final notation in his book, tore out the page, and flipped toward the SUV as though called by an invisible summons. The woman remained silent, her calm unbroken. She opened the hatch and removed a large, weathered black canvas bag etched with faint scuff marks. Embroidered on its side was a silver 6-pointed star, the silk thread dulled by time yet still striking against the canvas. The corners were frayed, hinting at countless missions long past, yet the emblem retained its precise geometry. She settled the bag onto the rear seat, adjusted the strap with meticulous care, and lowered the hatch until it clicked shut. Sergeant Lowell halted in his tracks, standing barely 6 feet from her. Dean slid to his left, planting one hand on his hip and looping his thumb over his belt. "Good morning, ma'am," Lowell began with a forced politeness that barely veiled his mockery. "Your vehicle is parked in violation of city regulations. Unless you're an active-duty federal official on assignment, I see no grounds to dismiss the citation." She did not reply. Her hand drifted to the bag's strap as her eyes methodically scanned the lot, as though calculating wind direction before taking a shot. Every nuance of her movement precise, economical. Dean arched an eyebrow and stepped forward, raising his voice so passers-by might catch every syllable. "Can't hear us? Or is English not your thing?" he sneered. A nearby teenager raised a phone, its screen glowing as it began to record. Dean pressed on. Usually these pretend soldiers pick crowd spots to show off, but no one here seems impressed by your little show. Still without a word, the woman zipped her bag closed, deftly folding the strap into its clip with seamless efficiency. She did not turn her head, did not meet their eyes, did not offer even a flicker of defiance or fear. Her silence felt heavier than any protest, and it visibly unnerved them. Lowell snapped his book open again, scribbled a few lines, and tore out the page. Holding it aloft, he demanded, "Name, ma'am?" She glanced at the paper, but made no move to take it. Her gaze steady and impassive, cool, unguarded yet impenetrable. Across the lot, the teenager's camera light blinked insistently, documenting every moment. Dean closed the final distance, his breath stirring the air between them. "Who are you calling, a lawyer?" "Too late for that, Grandma." In one swift motion, he snatched her phone, shoved her shoulder until her back thudded against the vehicle, and with his free hand snapped a nylon zip tie around her wrist. The click sounded just as the teen panned the camera back to capture the flash. Lowell advanced, his laughter low and cruel. "Curtains down on your performance," he said. "Now you can play the victim. We've got cameras rolling." They shoved her onto the curb beside a hairline fissure in the concrete, her hands bound behind her, head bowed until her eyes lifted to meet the lens of the recording device. Dean leaned in, his voice dripping sarcasm. "Next time, ma'am, hire a stylist if you're going to play soldier. Fake uniforms need real flair, or it just looks absurd." The woman closed her eyes for a heartbeat. When she reopened them, her gaze no longer burned into the officers, but at the camera, unflinching, resolute. Across the lot, a small child tugged at her mother's skirt, whispering, "Why isn't she saying anything?" The mother bent down and murmured back, "Because some people don't need words to make an entire crowd tremble." In that charged silence, it became clear they were not jeering at the woman before them, but at the very system that cast her in this role, a system that had already determined every beat of this unfolding story. The supermarket parking lot remained shrouded in a damp morning quiet, the sound of cartwheels gliding across concrete mixing with sporadic vehicle doors opening and closing. A black woman stood beside a jet-black SUV, yet to leave, her calm gaze as if waiting for a different question from a system she understood better than they did. Officer Pierce, the third cop to arrive, still held his iced coffee cup barely half empty. He strode forward with casual slowness, as though entering his own private joke, glanced at the woman, then at his teammates, and said with an unnecessarily loud tone and a mocking smirk, "Has the bit part action movie extra arrived yet? Fake cops need a permit for this." Sergeant Lowell immediately chimed in, stepping up with the air of confronting a familiar upstart. "Your name, papers, and reason for wearing that military look-at-me outfit. State them all." Teehee woman did not reply or argue. She only pulled out her phone from her jacket pocket, unlocked it with a short code, the screen lighting up without a blink. Deputy Dean, the youngest in the group, did not wait for orders. He stepped forward and slapped her wrist, holding the phone, jeering, "You ain't calling nobody, Grandma," before shoving her onto the hood of the SUV, the metal reflecting her face in a single instant. No anger, no fear, just the calm, trained expression of someone long prepared. Sergeant Lowell produced a white nylon zip tie from his belt and cinched it around her wrists. Everything unfolded in precise procedural order, only missing any legal justification. A small crowd began to form. A woman paused with her stroller. A teenager raised a phone to film. A middle-aged man halted beside his car. No one spoke, yet the air had shifted. Pierce lingered behind, sipping his coffee, studying the restrained woman like a prop at a casting. She must be auditioning for that out-of-work SWAT role, he laughed, turning to Dean. Even her stance seems mirror-trained, but no one else joined in. The woman remained pressed against the hood, her hands bound, silent and motionless as a breeze lifted the hem of her jacket to reveal the lower edge of a silver metal badge near her heart, not clear enough to see the details, but unusual enough to make Lowell frown. Dean bent down to pick up what he assumed was her dropped phone, but the screen awakened before he could reach it. No call icon, No emergency symbol, only a single line of text on a cold black background. Pentagon line, secured. The three officers froze, not because they understood immediately, but because their instincts told them this was not something any ordinary person could access. A calm voice then issued from the handset, not loud but crystal clear. Authentication pending, awaiting field authorization. Dean withdrew his hand. Lowell glanced at his partner, unsure what to say. Pierce stopped crunching the ice in his coffee, his gaze shifting from the phone screen to the woman's impassive face. Nearby, a boy standing by the stroller asked his mother who was she calling. She did not look back, but quietly replied, "No one. She just opened a door." And from a distance, a veteran in a worn jacket began walking toward the center of the lot, his pace unhurried, yet his gaze fixed. He did not draw a phone or yell, but his very presence made Pierce hesitate. At that moment, a young woman raised her camera, framing the bright phone screen where the same words glowed. Pentagon line secured. Dean withdrew his hand from his pocket, uncertain what to do next. Lowell gave no further orders, and Pierce stepped back a pace. Silence spread outward like an invisible circle. No one mentioned any administrative mistake, but all understood something had crossed a line. Throughout the tension, the woman remained wordless. She did not need to speak, for her call had pierced beyond human ears, straight into the command center of a system those three men never thought they would hear from someone like her. A calm, black woman who never raised her voice, yet whose phone had just delivered an unbreakable activation code they could not undo, and once they realized they could not reverse it, this story was no longer under their control. It was on record, and now it would spread not by shouting, but by the clear frames of that moment. A fine mist of rain began to sweep across the asphalt like unsolicited background noise, the tiny droplets striking passers-by's shoulders and vanishing as if wary of the silence in the lot. The black woman forced to sit on the curb edge with her head bowed and her wrists bound behind her by white zip ties, the SUV's hood still marked where her wrists had been pressed moments before. No one calling her name or daring more than a glance, yet no one walking away either. A teenager in an ash-colored hoodie backed up toward a light pole, holding his phone steady to record the first video clip from a diagonal angle when Deputy Dean shoved the woman onto the vehicle, now capturing the heavier stillness settling over the scene. His eyelids never flickering, his grip unshaken, while across the lane a 7-year-old girl grasped her mother's hem, eyes wide in incomprehension. "She didn't do anything," the child stammered, the mother's gaze fixed on the faint glow of the fallen phone screen by the woman's feet, unsure if she was witnessing an injustice or a lesson distorted by others. Sergeant Lowell bent down, his shoe grinding lightly on a paving stone, reached into the woman's jacket pocket, and withdrew a thick silver metal badge with rounded corners, etched in an unfamiliar code, squinting as he flipped it over before letting out a dry chuckle. "Let's see. A genuine silver ID," he said, then looked up at Dean and Pierce. "But why would an old lady have one?" Dean forced an uneasy laugh, as if to drown out the echo left by the phone's confirmation. Pierce, still silent since he'd stopped crunching ice in his coffee, both staring at the badge as though hoping it would prove counterfeit or vanish from their partner's hand. The woman remained motionless, her jacket beginning to soak through, shoulders tensing against the chill, chin lifted above the ground, her lowered face directing a slow, deliberate gaze across the crowd gathered beyond the street, pausing on the teenager's lens before sweeping over each onlooker, not seeking sympathy or crying for help, but cutting through every stare like a blade, leaving invisible scratches until Lowell dropped the badge back into her pocket and rose with uncharacteristic hesitation. Dean glanced swiftly toward the filming teen, still unmoving, camera raised despite the breeze lifting his hoodie's edge as if he were a silent broadcast tower, and muttered half to himself, half to nobody, "Want to go viral? Just wait until she cries," without looking back at the woman. The words hanging in the void, everyone could hear, not echoing, but landing like a slap. A middle-aged man in a rumpled dress shirt slowly pulled out his phone, took a single photo of the entire scene and captioned it, "She's sitting, 3 standing, but who's trembling?" Knowing within 3 minutes it would be retweeted nearly 10,000 times, while Dean bounced on his heels, staring at the woman in search of an angry reaction to justify more force. Unused to calm, trained to feed on rage, yet here there was only rain pooling on the hood and the rigidity of someone refusing to play by the rules he'd learned. And as a brown-skinned woman pushed her shopping cart past without stopping, but glanced back with a look of weary recognition, Pierce leaned toward Dean and whispered, "We should shut this down before it goes too far." Dean furrowed his brow in silence, knowing it had already gone too far from the moment he grabbed her wrist, and on that curb sat a handcuffed woman, unmoving, unshouting, whose presence drew every eye, froze every step, and stole every breath, while the steady rain fell as if to certify the unspoken truth that this was no longer about those standing around her, but about why the one sitting refused to break, and every camera, every gaze, every word to come would return to that moment, to realize that sometimes the thing that does not fall is the most terrifying of all. Rain had seeped into the road, trailing a silent chill with every footstep, and nobody spoke above a whisper. The crowd had swelled to over 30 people, fanning out in a half-circle, just close enough to see, but far enough to avoid getting drawn in, a few still recording while the rest stood mute, and the black woman sat low on the curb with white zip ties biting into her wrists, her head bowed as if never having lost her center of gravity. Her stillness commanding every gaze, no one knew what would happen next, yet all sensed that the next moment would no longer belong to anyone in uniform. Deputy Dean hovered closest, yet kept a half-guy's distance, and Sergeant Lowell stepped forward, drawing a small flashlight from his jacket and clicking it on, the beam stabbing straight into the woman's chest and pausing at the gap of her jacket where a glint of metal lay motionless beneath the rain. The round badge, slightly indented at the center and sharply embossed as if pressed by industrial machinery, reflected the tilted light in a mottled gray-white shimmer through the falling droplets, the inscription around the edge reading clearly, DOD, Strategic Command, Active Clearance Level 3. Dean's eyes narrowed and Lowell's hand stilled for a heartbeat. A young officer who had just arrived, possibly reassigned from a checkpoint, rushed over and froze at the sight of the illuminated emblem, staring at the lettering rather than the woman as his voice cracked in disbelief. I've seen this in strategic defense training, and though his words addressed no one in particular, they shifted the atmosphere entirely, prompting Dean to scoff. "Looks fake. Like something off Amazon, except for the glow under the light," and then to whisper, "Wait, why is it glowing?" Yet no one offered an answer. The woman lifted her head in a motion that seemed light, yet carried the weight of all that had gone unsaid, her eyes neither severe nor welcoming, but refusing to be held too long. And when she spoke, her voice was low, yet sharper than any command before. "You just shone a light on something that makes you stand at attention." 6 words, 6 cuts. 6 measured beats hammered into the concrete of unspoken power. Lowell recoiled as if burned, and the distant crowd stepped back in unison, no one daring to touch her or loosen the zip ties, silence settling not from inaction, but from awaiting the next cue, which arrived not from a drawn weapon or an order from a uniformed mouth, but from her own deliberate move. She tilted her wrist left and brushed her middle finger against the phone lying on the pavement, the screen flaring to life without effect or animation, revealing a single line of white text on a black field. Pentagon line secured. And suddenly not only the young officer but the entire circle leaned forward to read it, each person realizing that something had slipped beyond control. Not because the police had lost dominance, but because she had never relinquished command, as her phone emitted a clear female voice, awaiting authentication, General, prompting Dean to clench his jaw and Lowell to glance terrified at the nearest filmer, while Pierce stood 2 meters away, his coffee long cold, stunned that he'd just heard General, and awaiting authentication in the same breath from a handcuffed black woman on a rain-slick road, and, as someone in the crowd whispered, She's not calling the cops, she's calling the system on the cops. The sky darkened, the wind shifted, and people raised their phones, not to record, but to look up what Active Clearance Level 3 meant. All access points turning toward a power they had never witnessed from this angle, forcing everyone around her, for the first time, to reassess their own roles and recognize that their authority ended precisely where the flashlight beam had fallen, and that single moment was enough to upend the entire balance. Rain had stopped falling without anyone noticing, a light breeze skimming across the car roofs, carrying a strange stillness that made every faint sound in the crowded lot feel piercing, all eyes fixed on the black woman sitting upright on the damp concrete curb, with her wrists bound behind her by white zip ties, the phone at her feet still displaying Pentagon line secured, a message nobody fully understood, yet everyone felt the weight of. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rose, hoarse but steady, not questioning but certain, as if calling roll in a barracks. "I know her. That is Brigadier General Reva Miles. I saluted her in uniform." The man in the worn veteran's jacket stood motionless between two pickup trucks, like an unshaken foundation, his eyes never blinking as he spoke her name, as though each syllable had been practiced for years without error, and in that moment the circle fell silent. The videographers paused. Newcomers craned their necks to see the woman in handcuffs, some unaware of the name yet sensing from his gaze that explanation was unnecessary. The young officer who had discovered the strategic badge froze, his face ashen, turning slowly toward Sergeant Lowell, then back to the woman as his voice cracked out like a confession. We've just bound a serving general officer?" And though none of the police answered, the silence only amplified the question in every mind present. General officer, a military rank not for impersonators or those easily detained with a paperwork check, but a command structure, a tier of authority beyond any badge they could touch, now linked to a woman forced to the pavement by hands ignorant of whom they had restrained. Sergeant Lowell spun on the young officer, nearly shouting, "Shut your mouth! Who says you're not losing your mind?" His words aimed at no one in particular, yet all eyes shifted to the veteran, who remained unmoved, eyes open, shoulders steady, as if nothing could shake him, not because of stubbornness, but because he had known the woman's rank firsthand, not by rumor, but by standing at attention when she had passed. Brigadier General Miles slowly tilted her body, planted her feet on the cold pavement, and rose, her movement unhurried, yet weighted not by mass, but by an office never forfeited, despite 3 hands pressing her down, her gaze sweeping over the crowd without settling, wind catching the back of her jacket to reveal the emblem still intact, footsteps still marked in the wet surface, her shoulders square as if untouched. Then she turned to Dean and spoke each word with clear, measured authority. "You just bound a general officer in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and you recorded it." No one dared exhale after that. Her statement was not only an identity confirmation, but a silent verdict from the very system they served. And as Lowell stood frozen, the young officer stared at the ground. Pierce gripped his cold coffee cup, and the veteran's whisper traveled through the crowd. She didn't need unlocking. She just unlocked the entire system. A truth none disputed, for no one could deny what stood before them. The late afternoon sky deepened behind thin clouds drifting across skyscraper glass, while in a suburban cafe corner, second-year student Jamal Carson replayed the morning's video 3 times, before pausing on the final frame, the phone screen on the curb displaying Pentagon line secured, followed by the steady female AI voice. "Awaiting authentication, General." Jamal stared for a few seconds, then typed a simple caption, "She called Pentagon, cops cuffed her," without emojis or tags, and hit post. The phone's clock read 3:06 p.m. Outside the city carried on with car horns and sliding glass doors, unaware that within the hour, a viral chain reaction would drag the entire local power structure into public view. Fewer than 10 minutes after the clip hit Twitter, views topped 10,000 and comments poured in. "She said General, GGNERAL, who calls the Department of Defense while cuffed. This is real, right? This is actually real." Prominent military accounts joined the conversation. including @MIL Watchdog, with over 100,000 followers, which reposted the video with the note, "Her badge is genuine." That's a Department of Defense strategic ID issued to combat zone officers. Only high-level insiders hold one. Beneath that tweet, experts dissected the insignia's laser-etched details in unique reflective layer, elements impossible to counterfeit thanks to secure internal databases. Meanwhile, another user uploaded a screenshot zooming in on the reflection in one officer's sunglasses, revealing the nameplate, D. Jenkins. Captioned, "Officer D. Jenkins, you're done." The post spread instantly, prompting thousands to unearth Jenkins's public history, where old posts mocking the military and disparaging remarks surfaced. Under those archive statuses, new responses flooded in with outrage, stressing, "This isn't just prejudice, it's abuse of power." What began as a brief handheld video swiftly evolved into a living dossier, crowdsourced with verification and commentary at a pace law enforcement never anticipated. In a Southside barbershop, a veteran owner watched the afternoon news and muttered, "We were trained to stand at that command, not question it," upon hearing the AI voice clip. Simultaneously, a local reporter tweeted the first headline, "General Reva Miles, the 4202nd call that made the entire police system step back." Jamal received a message from a classmate. "Do you know what you just unleashed? Twitter's on fire." He didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the scrolling reactions. Anger, astonishment, skepticism, but mostly shared facts, images, and context. Former service members confirmed Reva's rank, and legal professionals cited federal immunity statutes protecting strategic military communications. The clip was remixed into analysis reels, with red boxes around the phone text, AI subtitles, and focus on Reva's assertion of her rank, all pointing to the same truth. This wasn't merely police brutality, but a clash between bias and genuine authority, instinctive reaction, and a system trained to obey without shouting. By 4 o'clock, the hashtag General Miles ranked third nationwide. No PR campaign, no algorithmic push, just individuals sharing, verifying, and connecting dots to rewrite reality. And amid all those details, the most striking fact wasn't the power of the handcuffed woman, but her unwavering calm from start to finish, as if she knew she didn't need to shout to be heard. She simply let the system she helped build speak. In a Washington, D.C. law office, social impact analysts bullet-pointed the officers' identities, the video's timestamp, its spread rate, and core keywords, noting an anonymous comment, "Power doesn't have to shout, it just needs to be recognized," followed by a screenshot of the final line, "Awaiting authentication, General," a proof needing no further confirmation because viewer reaction had already validated it. No press correction required, no third-party endorsement needed. What circulated was no longer mere information, but an irreversible effect triggered by someone who rose at the precise moment without anyone offering a hand. Just hours after the first clip exploded across social media, a second video emerged from the personal account of an elderly woman living near the supermarket, filmed on an outdated phone with grainy visuals but offering an indispensable perspective. From the left, closer and more direct, entirely steady. Lasting under a minute, it required no voiceover to convey the scene. The black woman in handcuffs, Dean's elbow driving her onto the SUV's hood, Pierce's smirk as he hovered behind her, and above all, Lowell's flashlight beam illuminating the metal badge on her left chest, that gleaming insignia now etched into every procedural record as an unerasable truth. That second video rippled outward, first on Facebook and Reddit, where within 20 minutes it was clipped into a TikTok post, bearing the bold overlay, "No one may cuff a general on duty, so why did this happen?" Instantly, thousands of stunned, enraged comments flooded in. "She literally said general, General. Who even calls the Department of Defense while cuffed? This has to be real, right?" And more seasoned observers began digging for corroboration. Crucially, the narrative shifted from a singular act of misconduct to the recognition of an unprecedented precedent. Never before had a serving general been shackled in public, much less while actively communicating with the Pentagon. Within the hour, a prominent law professor at a top university published a rapid-fire analysis citing Section 4.3 of the Federal Strategic Communications Protection Act. No one, under any local law enforcement authority, may obstruct or interrupt the communications signal of an officer in strategic command during a high-level security connection. His accompanying commentary left no room for debate. Interfering with a general officer's emergency communications is prosecutable as obstruction of national security. Those words cut through the system's veneer, redirecting online focus from Dean's brute force or Pierce's smug laughter to the far greater question of how three seasoned officers could fail to recognize the rank they confronted, or why internal protocols had not preemptively flagged the encounter. Digital activists and casual viewers alike began compiling frames from multiple posts into seamless sequences. Riva's calm stance beside the SUV, her gaze isolated between three uniformed men, the moment she was shoved onto the hood, the tight zip tie cutting into her wrist, and finally, her measured lift of the chin as the phone's screen glowed Pentagon line secured. One user captioned the montage, "This isn't mere prejudice. This is a system driving in the wrong lane." On Reddit forums known for skepticism, threads recounted a decade of high-profile identity mix-ups, from a federal judge briefly detained to a CIA agent mistaken for a suspect, yet none had echoed as powerfully a general handcuffed mid-mission. Prior errors ended in release within minutes, one commenter observed, but here they kept her bound in defiance of her badge and her Pentagon call. This wasn't a mistake, it was disbelief. Disbelief was a choice. Across TikTok, where reactions unfold in seconds, countless recreations went viral. One clip, shared nearly 1 million times, opened with, "Think you have power?" She called the Pentagon in the middle of arrest, overlaying images of police uniforms, city badges, patrol cars, then cutting abruptly to Riva rising with the zip ties still on her wrists, closing with, "One call, 3 careers, a new standard." That succinct summation became the story's enduring legacy, a stark symbol of the collision between ingrained bias and authentic authority, between reflexive force and a command structure trained to obey without raising its voice. Viewers of the second video were no longer bystanders. They became moral witnesses, compelled to choose between denial and acceptance, and most, however reluctantly, chose to believe. For no one could reconstruct Riva Miles's unwavering gaze, the AI voice calmly intoning, "Awaiting authentication, General," or the badge's unmistakable gleam under a flashlight without incontrovertible proof embedded in original data, proof that needed neither press clarification nor third-party validation. What poured forth was no longer mere footage, but an irreversible effect catalyzed by a woman who stood firm at the precise moment, without assistance, without fanfare, yet wielding the authority she had always held. When social media's heat reached the point where the boundaries between information and action began to blur, people no longer shared a simple video just to react. They started to trace, not with specialized forensic tools, but with something even more powerful: collective memory, outrage, and the open data prowess of millions. The name Jenkins, after a few frames magnified from sunglasses and a reflection on a nearby parked car, quickly became the first target pulled into the light. An amateur programmer applied character recognition software to verify the name on the uniform badge, then cross-referenced it with the city police department's internal roster, and in just 20 minutes, the name Dean Jenkins appeared alongside documents that had been removed from the public GERD site. A Reddit user accessed a cached version of the page and uncovered 3 lawsuits involving Jenkins over the course of 8 years on the force, each sharing the same thread. Victims were people of color who complained of threats, humiliation, and unreasonable intervention. Each case closed with that familiar phrase, "handled internally." As that information spread, viewers stopped questioning the momentary act and instead asked how long a systemic pattern had been covered up. One pinned comment on Twitter read, "The police didn't just handcuff her, they carried an unchecked file." Riding that wave, a veteran lawyer's account unexpectedly spoke up. His name was Ray Alvarez, who had represented a client in a dispute with Dean Jenkins 6 years earlier. That case never reached court because evidence was excluded, but this time Ray kept it short and wrote, "I'm not glad he was arrested. I'm glad he was seen." Those words were pinned beneath the post that had drawn over 1 million interactions. They struck at the very shield that had protected Jenkins, needing no denunciation or demands, just the truth laid bare, so nothing prior could be concealed again. Simultaneously, Instagram circulated a still cut from the second video, the moment 3 officers, Dean, Lowell, and Pierce, smiled as they tightened the zip tie around Ms. Reba's wrists. The frame caught Dean's lip curling, Lowell glancing sideways, and Pierce looking down as if checking the pressure. None looked into her eyes or noticed the phone at her feet. The caption was succinct: "This is the smile that ruined 3 lives." That image swept through Instagram and was remixed endlessly. Some overlaid red text reading "Evidence, not emotion." Others superimposed their faces onto a mock indictment poster. Yet the original stood out above all. It required no effects. Its living indictment was crafted by their own smiles, unaware of the consequences. At the same time on Twitter, the hashtag General Miles shot into the national top 3, eclipsing breaking political and protest news. People shared not because she was a general, but because her silence had shaken a system used to shouting orders without fear of scrutiny. A pinned comment under the second video, simple and chilling, read, "She didn't resist, she let the camera speak." 60 characters, over 1 million likes. That line became the headline of international outlets as British, Canadian, and German media began reporting. Asian networks highlighted the trampled military honor, and a Tokyo news channel even translated the phrase into Japanese to open a special on law enforcement discrimination in America. Strangely, Ms. Reva Miles did not step in to speak, issue a statement, or represent anyone. Her silence did not render her absent, but made her presence unavoidable. People projected onto her the image of self-control, dignity, and the refusal to justify herself. While the 3 officers were named one by one with ranks and records laid bare, she, the one who was handcuffed, became the only subject who needed no words to be acknowledged. A prominent legal podcast opened its new episode with the question, when someone is mistaken for a civilian yet is a general and does not have to shout to prove it, where does the fault lie? In the one who cuffs, or the system that grants the right to cuff without verification? No one answered, yet the episode's listeners soared to 5 times the average within 3 hours. Dean Jenkins, once a familiar name on the police beat, is now branded a federal-level abuse of power. Lowell and Pierce have not faced formal charges, but their names trail each development and hashtag. No indictment has been issued, yet social media has already held its first hearing. And if the system remains silent, every reshared video becomes a fresh protest. No lawyers, no courtroom needed. Ms. Reva has not returned to any camera, nor sent messages of gratitude or anger. Yet whenever someone searches police cuff general by mistake, Reva Miles appears first, linked with images impossible to fake. That alone is enough to tip the scales of justice in the right direction, through the very frames once overlooked by 3 officers who thought they could cuff anyone unless stopped. But they forgot one thing: some people do not need to release the zip tie to make the entire system tighten around itself. At the end of the day, when television news had begun replaying the first round and social media comments still surged, an unexpected leak threw everything into the danger zone, where police actions no longer remained personal but emerged as part of a system. An internal email from the city police department was leaked to a private forum for former law enforcement officers. Within 5 minutes, the email screenshot was shared and appeared across numerous Twitter accounts dedicated to media manipulation. The subject line was concise, but the wording made anyone in the field realize something was being buried. Disengage from Incident 1074B, Escalation Risk Beyond Protocol. That directive clearly did not aim to investigate or promote transparency, but carried the tone of a defensive mechanism drafted to shield before anyone could dig into the core issue. Immediately after the screenshot surfaced, legal experts began parsing its implications. Incident 1074B was identified as the internal code for the parking lot case involving Reva Miles. The order to disengage, meaning withdraw all unit response, combined with the escalation risk warning, implied that department leadership knew the gravity of confronting a general officer but chose evasion over correction or admission. Or this was confirmed when a tech officer formerly in the department's IT division, posting anonymously as RN Signal, released a short clip extracted from Dean Jenkins's dashcam. The significance lay not in the footage, but in the audio track. In the full recording at second 38, you can clearly hear Reva Miles state, "I am establishing strategic connection, access authorized by direct order from the general staff." But in the version officially released by the police department early in the afternoon, that audio was obscured and replaced by wind noise and sirens. Our Signal posted both versions with a single caption, "Who edited this and why?" That question hit like a bucket of cold water for anyone still believing this was a simple mistake. When the truth is cut out, and what is cut is the confirmation of military identity, it ceases to be a technical error and becomes deliberate manipulation. Under RN Signal's post, hundreds commented. Some compared the voice in the clip with publicly released military training recordings, verifying that Reva Miles' use of strategic connection and access by direct order matched the standardized language for officers in strategic command. Another commenter presented internal training documents confirming that suppressing a senior officer's statement in cases of abuse of authority violated Article 5.2 of the Transparency Rules. If authenticated, the entire department management could face an investigation for intentional information fabrication. The dashcam clip's alteration shocked not only because the content was warped, but also because it revealed fear inside the system. Those controlling the information stream failed to grasp that in a world where anyone can broadcast independently, censorship is not a safety measure, but a trigger. Every edit, every clipped audio snippet, every evasive email builds a self-written indictment by those who believed they had the power to erase traces. Since the leak of the email and clip, the focus has shifted. Previously, attention zeroed in on the three officers as the wrongdoers, but now eyes turn to their superiors, those who may have known, or worse, commanded, the suppression of the very information that made the incident critical. And as the chase continues, full dashcam copies have been downloaded tens of thousands of times into global digital archives, ready to resurface whenever someone attempts to dodge accountability. In the sleepless data world, no internal order can erase what the crowd has seen and decided to remember. Amid the wave of data spilling from all sides, an anonymous call broadcast on a policy discussion radio channel drew attention, no less than any video clip, the caller withholding his name and only confirming he was an active duty officer in the same area where the incident occurred, his voice steady, though carrying the depth of someone who has kept silent too long and now wants to speak once and for all. "We were trained to recognize threats," he said, "trained to handle high-stress situations, assess unusual behavior, and apply appropriate force. But there is one thing the curriculum never covered. We were not trained to recognize the power of silence." The host paused for a few seconds as if to give listeners time to process that statement, then asked slowly, "You mean," and the answer needed no further analysis, "I mean we are only taught to react to what is loud, what crosses limits, what shows hostility, but that woman did none of those. She stood, she called out, she was handcuffed, and all of it happened without any of us truly understanding the rank we were facing." That confession was neither an excuse nor a defense. It was like a shard of broken mirror falling from the system, sharp enough to reflect the entire gap years of training never filled. While that call was still being reshared across platforms, another video surfaced, this one only 15 seconds from a bystander's dashcam, capturing the moment Dean stood close beside Reva, smiling not loudly or theatrically but with clear self-satisfaction, his left hand sliding down to snatch her phone from her grasp, the motion quick and decisive, as if part of a familiar control routine. What made that clip go viral was not the phone snatch, but the frozen frame captured by online users at the exact moment Dean's hand came away from Riva's wrist, highlighted in red and magnified down to every tendon, while Riva's gaze did not flinch. That detail created an effect of calm opposed to brute force that could not be denied. And below the image was a pinned caption, "You stopped her call, but not her rank." That photo became the unofficial symbol of the case, printed on T-shirts, on analytical article covers, and used as the backdrop for countless podcasts on soft power, with former military personnel recalling briefings where generals never needed to shout or clamor for authority, only to appear at the right moment, confirming that the most frightening force was not the anger of the cuffed, but the silence of someone who knew they could reclaim everything later without raising their voice. The image was more than a moment frozen in time. It was a testament, not because it showed an unjust act, but because it summed up the system's distortion in judging who posed a threat and who had the right to speak. And while removing her phone was meant to control, that very removal began a chain of connection no three uniformed men ever imagined would one day leave them caught not among a crowd, but before millions of shares and eyes fixed on a decision the system once thought trivial, now a lesson that cannot be unlearned. The city sky was gloomy, as if forewarning an afternoon that could not be shielded by equivocal answers. In front of the Central Police Headquarters, 10 reporters stood close together, holding microphones and phones aimed in the same direction. Below the motionless flags, the face of Chief Holtz appeared amid the sea of recording equipment. He wore an ash-gray plainclothes suit, stood erect, yet lacked decisiveness, his eyes hidden behind glasses shining with caution rather than readiness. The press conference was convened at the public's demand, not out of voluntary transparency, and from the very first question the room's atmosphere condensed into an invisible band of pressure. One female reporter in the front row stood up, her voice not high but firm. "Is the person arrested in the viral video truly an active-duty military officer?" The entire courtyard seemed to pause for a second. Holtz did not turn away, but glanced at his legal advisor standing near the podium. He inhaled, a breath longer than normal, then answered, "We have not verified it, but if it is true, there will be additional information." Those 8 words immediately sent a wave of reaction beyond the brick walls of headquarters. A Twitter account with more than 300,000 followers immediately reposted the exact answer, attached the video that had circulated for 3 days, and added a comment as sharp as a blade. "Additional information? She called the Pentagon right in front of you. Below it lay more than 5,000 shares in the first half hour, including one remark, 'The nation has already verified it while the department waits for orders.' The anger did not come from a lack of facts, but from the highest authority choosing to wait instead of confirming what millions had seen, heard, and understood more clearly than any official statement. On television, the press conference ran in split screen, Chief Holtz reading the statement on the left, and on the right, the image of Riva Miles standing tall in the parking lot, a zip tie still around her wrists, and her phone on the ground displaying the words "Pentagon line secured." A news anchor commented with a bitter tone, "It seems the people's verification system is now faster than the official response mechanism." A former investigator from the Department of Justice published a lengthy post on his personal platform, analyzing, "If a regular police officer can decide to handcuff someone in less than 2 minutes, then a chief of police might well issue a confirmation within 3 days." That opinion was quoted across dozens of news sites and became the focal point of evening commentary programs. Meanwhile, outside the press hall, protesters gathered in clusters, each holding a wooden placard bearing quotes from the event, such as, "She did not resist, she let the camera speak," or "You stopped her call, but not her rank." They did not shout slogans, they simply stood in silence, and that presence made the atmosphere inside shrink by the minute. When the press conference ended, no further questions were answered. Holtz exited via a side door without looking at the reporters or glancing through the glass where a woman stood with her back to him, wearing a long coat and holding a printed excerpt from the Federal Military Code. No one touched her or asked who she was. Yet a reporter captured that image and it became the cover photo for the next morning's article, Echoes from the Civilian. The story has moved beyond debating right or wrong into a realm where evasion is judged as harshly as the initial act, and there each delay in confirmation is not merely waiting for information, but evidence of delay, of willful avoidance, of a system unready to call by name the person they once handcuffed. Yet the public already did, and they will not wait any longer. After the controversial press conference, the first official information came not from the city police or the mayor's office, but from the Department of Defense. A concise release sent early morning through the Pentagon's official channels without flourish or exposition, a single sentence of 42 words. General Reva Miles remains in strategic command within the Joint Regional Task Force and is fully cooperating with the federal investigation into the events of that day. The statement was immediately viewed by the media as an undeniable milestone, the first time a federal authority confirmed the identity, rank, and active status of the woman in the video, turning prior speculation into fact and rendering the police's hints of badge forgery meaningless. And from that moment, every city denial fell out of tune. The online community treated the release as the final confirmation they had awaited, one security analysis account declaring, "If you still think she is a civilian, you are watching the wrong country," a verdict that spread across dozens of analytical clips. Military forums labeling the episode a normalization failure, and behind the veil of official silence, many within law enforcement began to feel the mounting pressure of media and public scrutiny. 36 hours after the Pentagon statement, a brief news item on the city police website announced that the 3 officers involved had been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a comprehensive investigation by an independent unit, no names given. Yet within 10 minutes, major outlets identified Dean Jenkins, Lowell, and Pierce, and though the news held no surprise, the timing did, arriving only after pressure had exceeded what delay statements could contain. That same afternoon, a source inside City Hall confirmed that Dean Jenkins had submitted his resignation at 9:42 a.m. via email with no press release or farewell statement. The subject line reading, "Request to resign effective immediately," a copy of which surfaced on a local administrative forum under the title, "When you no longer have the power to make someone stand still, what do you still hold on to?" The suspension of the 3 did not quell the outcry, but clarified a long-held suspicion. Official action only arrives when the system can no longer ignore wrongdoing, not out of acknowledgement of fault, but because it is forced to admit there is none left to deny, as one veteran reporter observed. This is when we see the difference between responsible action and defensive reaction. The story did not end with a handcuffing incident, but opened deeper layers about process, about how a system responds to its own errors, and how the public leverages data to shape political response more effectively than any legislator, and Reva Miles, though she has not spoken since standing in that parking lot, remains present in every analysis and every comment as the figure who compels us to redefine power not by title, but by the ability to stop an entire system and make it look. The special hearing room was temporarily set up on the 3rd floor of the Federal Administrative Building, long used for city internal investigations, but this time the tables and chairs could not hold everyone present. On the left sat representatives from the Department of Justice, expressionless as a slab of stone against a neutral backdrop. On the right, the team responsible for internal coordination of the city police. Opposite them, 2 senior officers sent from the Department of Defense in plain clothes. Yet every movement made clear they were not there to listen to reports. And in the center stood the single microphone before Police Chief Holtz, who sat upright yet lacked the firmness he had shown at the press conference a few days earlier. As the news cruiser billowed, the hearing was convened at the request of multiple agencies after a series of details from the incident spread outside, indicating serious violations in the identification and handling procedures for a subject related to strategic security. Previous testimonies were insufficient and closed-door meetings no longer carried weight. Holtz knew he had no choice but to answer. When asked why his 3 officers handcuffed a person bearing a Department of Defense badge despite clear warnings from her personal device, Holtz looked down at the stack of documents in his hands for several seconds before looking up, his tone even and cautious. "We followed the procedure for counterfeiting detection of uniforms. In a high-stress situation, a single indicator is not enough to confirm identity, and verification must be conducted at the unit." The answer rang out in the silent room like a conclusion premeditated yet full of evasion. The representative from the Department of Defense placed her hands on the table without tapping a pen or leafing through papers. She fixed her gaze on Holtz, her eyes shining not with anger, but with familiarity with false reason. "And how do you define counterfeiting? A black woman wearing a genuine badge?" The question sliced through the room, targeting not the records, but the bias hidden beneath the procedure. The room fell silent, not from surprise, but because no one wanted to exhale first. At the moment the core of the dialogue had been exposed. Holtz faltered, his eyes shifting to the city attorney seated behind him, who remained motionless. The Department of Defense representative continued in the same tone. "We use 2 layers of encryption for strategic-grade badges. Anyone who has worked with the system knows they cannot be forged. And in the video, did you see anyone checking the encryption layer, or did you only see a hand pushing, a zip tie in use, and a look of disbelief from start to finish?" A Department of Justice official interjected in a near whisper yet clear voice. "This is no longer about procedures. It is a reflex of a system when faced with something it is not accustomed to admit." Next to him, another person took notes without a tremor in their pen. Holtz said nothing immediately and looked down at the table. What was once considered a professional response now stood as evidence of lack of control. Not because the force lacked information, but because information was stripped from perception from the start. An officer seated in the back, who once belonged to the city's rapid response team, clenched his hands but was not called to speak. Yet his eyes never left the screen showing the frame of Reva Miles in handcuffs, with the words "Pentagon line secured" as clear as a verdict. The story no longer stopped at who had done wrong, but extended to the system that allowed that wrong to persist as a natural reflex. And in that hearing room, every word was recorded, archived, and rearranged to build a new dossier, one this time not written by the police, not investigated by insiders, and in which those under scrutiny were not the victim but those who believed power was something you wore rather than something that can be summoned on a parking lot. The hearing had not concluded, but outside the room another event was already reshaping public perception, beyond any control by the system. And among the videos extracted and analyzed by independent groups, one clip from a dash cam positioned behind the parking lot drew particular media attention. The angle not as striking as previous viral videos, yet thanks to its high resolution and steady framing, people could, for the first time, clearly see Dean Jenkins's full movement from the moment he approached Ms. Reva until he applied the handcuffs. A slow-motion segment shown on the evening news of a national channel revealed that it was the very motion of tugging her sleeve to pull her back into view that exposed the military badge, a detail missed in earlier subjective analyses but now visible in every frame, and in that movement the metal badge near her left breast slipped out from the draped coat, catching the light on Dean's face just before he signaled to Pierce, prompting a new question. Had they seen it and then ignored it? An independent media watchdog released its official analysis that same night, stating the physical action by the enforcement officers actually contributed to revealing a highly authentic identification artifact, meaning not only did they fail to verify, they themselves exposed it. And proceeding with the handcuffing after physical contact and discovery of the genuine badge renders the handling a systemic error at the level of awareness, no longer confined within procedural deviation. That conclusion spread faster than news of the hearing, and people began to frame the issue in deeper legal terms, asking whether accidentally seeing and then disregarding constituted subjective error. And if the badge was real, the signal real, the identity real, then the very thing denied from the outset was that a black woman could wield authority without having to prove it verbally. The next morning, a long-established newspaper published a commentary under a headline as stark as a slap: "Real handcuffs, real crime." But the humiliation is infinite. No illustrative images, no sensational colors, just a white background and 4 lines of black text. The piece calling for no action, but listing the small details viewers had witnessed over the past days. Ms. Riva's gaze as she was held, the phone sending its signal, the badge's reflection, and finally Dean's expression as he looked down yet tightened the zip tie. Over the following 48 hours, that headline was reprinted across local and international outlets, quoted on radio programs and shared as reminder rather than rallying cry, and those who had tried to soften the narrative began withdrawing from public forums. Even some system-aligned analysts shifted tone from defense to emphasizing lack of oversight, yet no one believed that was the sole reason, for public discourse had gone beyond explanation and was demanding a uniform, and honor was no longer clear. The special hearing room lay deep beneath the federal headquarters, soundproofed and unmarked, fluorescent lights shining straight down on the metal table, everything in the room radiating the anonymity of a dedicated structure where there are no invitations, only obligations. And at the center sat General Riva Miles, upright, her face betraying the fatigue of days spent at the eye of the storm, yet her bearing showing no hint of concession. Opposite her 2 investigators in dark dress shirts, hands resting on closed files, both having read every page and not there to revisit facts, but to probe deeper into the reasons and logic behind the moments that turned the system upside down. The investigator on the left inclined his head in protocol, then spoke slowly and clearly. "What was the reason you called the Pentagon directly?" For a brief instant, the room fell completely silent, as if the very air awaited where she would choose to begin. And Riva did not answer immediately, instead looking up straight into the light, casting one cheek in sharp relief, before speaking in a measured voice with each word carrying its own weight like a pre-shaped report. "I was disabled by those who do not understand the system. I merely rebooted it." Her answer caused one of the 2 across the table to shift expression, not in disagreement but in recognition, for each term she chose was precise, not emotional. Disabled being a military term meaning removed from operational capability rather than injured or insulted. Those who do not understand the system, referring not only to the 3 officers but to the administrative reflexes that allowed this to happen, and rebooted, not a reaction, but a reestablishment of command sequence, concise, without any show of force. A moment later, the investigator on the right turned a page, eyes fixed on her, and asked, without courtesy, "Do you feel you used personal power to pressure a civilian law enforcement authority?" Riva did not blink. "I did not use power, I used authority," she said, leaning forward slightly, not to intimidate but to ensure the next words could not be misinterpreted in tone. "Power can exert pressure, authority is responsibility, affirmed by law. When I made that call, I did not give orders, I reported." He nodded, knowing not everyone distinguishes between those concepts, but for her, they marked the boundary between a defensive action and an unlawful reversal of command. She did not summon any force nor ask for their sanction. She only reported, precisely and faithfully, a breach of strategic communications security, and once the signal was recognized, the entire system operated as designed. Before the session ended, the investigator on the left asked one more question not on the official list. "If you were not a general, what would have happened?" Riva lifted her gaze, her eyes not cold but direct. "That has already happened to thousands of people. I am simply the version captured on film." And in that moment, the room lost its purely functional character, becoming the resting place of a final statement, not as personal opinion, but carrying the certainty born of an entire system's experience with repeated error. The 2 investigators said nothing further, rising and exchanging a look while General Miles remained seated, the fluorescent light from above glinting off the badge on her left shoulder, and in that closing moment no one in the room felt the need to rap the gavel, write another record, or confirm her final words. For everything had been recorded and, more importantly, understood. The room seemed to shrink when the next question rang out. No longer about legal frameworks or communication protocols, the investigator's tone, as even as someone trained to conceal emotion yet with intent clear, "You did not order an assault nor summon security. Why?" In the atmosphere already dense with precise answers, that question stabbed through the thin membrane of silence, guarding the event's true nature. Miles sat motionless, the white light reflecting in her eyes as she spoke slowly, each word shaped like a formed report. "I did not need to use force when truth can prove itself." Her voice, devoid of flourish, yet each turn cut deeper meaning into the notion of reaction. She had not called a military base to deploy forces, nor activated any priority channel to compel units to obey. She did only one thing: opened the link to authenticate identity and let the incident unfold before those who thought they controlled the situation. One investigator's expression flickered, as if weighing the line between military authority and self-restraint. Neither spoke again immediately, for Miles had provided what few in the system had ever seen: a choice capable of turning the tables completely, yet preserved in its passive form, allowing the wrongdoing to reveal itself fully without any coercive tool. The remaining investigator opened his file and turned to witness statements, video reports, internal testimony, pausing at the timestamp capturing Miles pressed against the hood, followed by her phone signal lighting up. No counterattack, no directive, only a gaze and a technical cue, the calm unfolding of procedure amid impulsiveness and bias. And when he asked, "You did not seek to control the situation through confrontation?" she shook her head almost imperceptibly. "I did not wish to control. I wanted clarity so no one could deny it." Her closing words stripping away the veneer of power games to reveal a deeper principle. Some authority needs no display to exist, and thus the entire affair gained a new meaning, not merely as an error, but as proof of the gap between instinctive reaction and a responsibility so honed it requires no show of force. The Civil Rights Law Office occupied an old building of red brick walls beneath faded wooden shutters bleached by sun, and that morning the meeting room felt stifling not from heat but from a document newly unearthed. When a paralegal laid a thick 36-page printout on the metal table, a federal directive numbered 38/4.3, titled in words that conveyed its gravity to any reader, "Federal Law on the Right of Self-Defense for Strategic Officers and Preservation of Security Communication Lines." Under Section 4.3, the text, double underlined, read, "No one, including state law enforcement agencies, may obstruct, delay, or disable the strategic communications of an officer on duty under any circumstances, except by written order from a senior defense coordination authority." And beneath that clause, a brief footnote warned, "Violation may result in federal criminal liability." The moment that excerpt appeared on a public interest law forum, legal watchdogs began re-examining every detail of the parking lot incident. For Reva Miles's direct call to the Pentagon at the moment she was prevented from speaking ceased to be an isolated fact and became concrete proof that Section 4.3 had been utterly violated, not through misunderstanding, but by unlawful coercion, without any functional identity check, even though her signal was both legitimate and uninterrupted. The statute itself was not new, having existed for over 2 decades and last updated 12 years ago after a military scandal on the outskirts of Dallas, in which an officer was blocked from system access while handling a false threat scenario. That revision hailed as a landmark for clarity, especially in cases of civilian interference with military channels without grasping command protocols. The veteran attorney on the Special Investigation Team then revealed what few had noticed. The principal drafter of the amendment to Section 4.312 Years earlier was Brigadier General Reva Miles, then Director of Strategic Training at the Pentagon, not merely an advisor, but one of the authors who designed the linkage between communication systems and strategic identification processes, meaning the woman handcuffed in the video was herself an architect of the very legal principle that was broken during her call from the parking lot. That revelation instantly transformed public perception of the case. Where once commentators spoke of misconduct, flawed reactions, even training gaps, now the system could not claim ignorance or ambiguity in applying the law, for they had violated a rule meant to protect people like her, crafted by her own hand, prompting one journalist to write, "Nothing hurts more than seeing the law you helped draft trampled by someone convinced they are in the right." Words shared across dozens of outlets alongside images showing her name in the statute's appendix beside a frame of her bent over the hood, and within the Department of Justice a task force began assembling records to consider federal criminal charges, shifting the question from who was right to why the system failed to recognize that the keeper of the law was being treated as an impersonator. The silence of Reva in the period following the call is now interpreted differently. She spoke nothing because she did not need to. She let the very text she had helped create speak in return, not through statements but through legal force. And the day Section 4.3 was publicly reopened was the day the entire chain of events from the parking lot to the police headquarters was cast into a light no denial could ever obscure. Amid the densely printed lines of the federal document reviewed after more than a decade, there is a small note at the end of Appendix B, where advisory team comments are contained. The line, "without legal weight or special notation, yet valued as an ethical directive from its author. Silence is strategy. If we teach others how to endure, we must also teach them when it is no longer required." Unsigned, but known to those in defense strategy as a phrase often cited in internal lectures by Brigadier General Reva Miles. That sentence was not meant to encourage confrontation. It is a principle. Patience does not equal perpetual suffering, and silence does not mean relinquishing one's voice. And in the very context in which Section 4.3 was being reinstated, this idea served as a compass to distinguish strategic discipline from passivity, and now the principle she once taught is read not in a training session but in an official investigative record, serving as a reminder that her silence was not retreat, but a deliberate action framed in advance, with each detail operating on the premise that the system would reveal its own flaws when not forced. The investigation has grown deeper, no longer focused solely on the handling of the three officers, but expanding into depth. Investigators are linking every chain, from the on-scene response and subsequent media directives, to the administrative system's effort to maintain a legal gray zone to delay accountability, yet in all reports, recordings, and testimonies, there is not a single line from Reva Miles demanding compensation or issuing a personal account. That absence noted internally led one investigator, while reviewing the files, to utter what became the final acknowledgement. She does not need to sue. Her presence is indictment enough. Those words echoed in the small conference room without a microphone, never entered into the record, but spreading like a realization among those working with the truth, that in some cases proving wrongdoing does not come from legal charges or public campaigns, but from the weight of an unbendable presence, someone who drafted the law, understood it, and chose to act in its spirit when many would have found an excuse to respond with force. And from the federal investigators' inner chambers to the halls of law schools, that marginal note has been cited again, not as a slogan or manifesto, but as a silent counter-argument beneath every old video clip, every photograph of handcuffing, and every final second of the recording when the system recognized the signal, general, authenticated, its words a quiet rebuttal to all who once hid behind procedure as a shield for bias. And in that expanding discourse, the name Reva Miles needs no plaintiff's role, no legal team at her heels, and no press cameras outside her office. For each frame, document, and statute invoked with her name at the end stands as a more powerful affirmation than any speech. Truth need not be shouted to become irrefutable. It need only be defined rightly, at the right moment, by someone who understands both authority and limitation, and from the moment that was recognized, the system ceased investigating her and instead confronted its own reflection, shown most clearly through the one it had so grievously misjudged. Inside a conference room deep within the strategic control floor of the Pentagon, a closed-door meeting was convened early in the morning, unannounced, without a press release, and with no updates on any official portal. Everyone summoned was required to leave their phones outside, and the attendance list was locked the moment the meeting room door shut. There were no slide decks, no lengthy plans. Only a single objective, a comprehensive verification of Brigadier General Reva Miles' conduct, schedule, and work procedures during the week before and after the incident at the parking lot. A digital map lit up on the wall, displaying every stop Reva made over 10 consecutive days, using data from the military-grade GPS embedded in her assigned vehicle. Each destination was clearly marked, linked together in a continuous chain across military installations and regional coordination offices. On the map, there were no detours to unauthorized locations, no unaccounted time gaps long enough to raise suspicions of personal travel. She took only 3 scheduled days of leave, then returned to duty without missing any of the required meetings. Every hour of the week was accounted for with verified information. While the data analysts worked at the front of the room, another investigative team reviewed footage from public traffic cameras, focusing particularly on the area where the incident occurred. They traced back the frames over several days, cross-checking license plates, vehicle IDs, and recorded stop points. Every frame aligned with her declared itinerary. More importantly, in all the compiled clips, there was no indication of misconduct on Reva's part. No traffic violations, no disputes at any stops, no presence in areas typically considered ambiguous in terms of mission relevance. When the report was delivered, the lead analyst said only one thing: no gaps. Every one of her actions left a clear trace, and her presence at the parking lot that day was neither random nor off course. It was part of an unscheduled logistics inspection, authorized 2 weeks in advance. That means the timing of her appearance at the site was a direct result of a legitimate work schedule. Her presence needed no justification. It was baked into the operational rhythm that both the military and civilian enforcement had grown accustomed to treating as 2 separate orbits, and it was precisely that misunderstanding that triggered the entire chain reaction. A member of the internal investigation team asked, "Is there any data that contradicts General Miles's statement?" The reply didn't come from the tech division, but from the security cross-check unit. None. Every login to the system, every encrypted communication, every call made from her personal device matches the logs. She deleted nothing. Everything. No data was altered after the incident. Everything was left intact, as if the system itself would testify in place of any defense. In the military, data isn't just numbers. It's living proof, stored through processes that cannot be manipulated without leaving a trace. And in Reva's case, that data functioned like a uniform, unworn yet capable of confirming her role, location, and the full legitimacy of her position. It required no declaration, no nameplate. It existed through the way she moved, the way the system recorded her, and the flawless alignment between the individual and her function. Here is the accurate and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, all content intact, all numbers written in words, with minimal use of em-dashes and consistent punctuation. At the end of the meeting, no one made any recommendations. There were no minutes to sign. Everything was so clear that no judgment was needed. The meeting ended with a short silence, not from lack of conclusion, but because everyone understood that what needed verification had already been done by the system long ago. And the only thing left was how the external law enforcement system had failed to recognize that when the person in front of them was a living witness to a policy they had not yet read, each act of force was no longer a personal mistake, but a denial of evidence in human form. After the journey maps, location data, and sequences of public camera footage were fully reviewed, those in the closed-door meeting had nothing left to dispute about the legitimacy of every move made by Brigadier General Reva Miles. From the operating system to her personal information, from mission orders to leave time, everything matched. There were no signs of fraud, no gaps to justify a misunderstanding. She had nothing more to explain. The legal and technical structure had done that for her, cleanly and beyond dispute. In a moment of silence during the meeting, a senior defense official sitting at the far end of the table suddenly spoke. He did not look at the screen or direct his words to anyone in particular. His sentence landed like a clean cut through the layers of deflection crafted to dodge responsibility. The police didn't arrest the wrong person. They just didn't think power could look like that. The statement needed no explanation. Those present immediately understood he was not pointing to procedural error or legal ambiguity, but to the bias that had shaped the behavior of people who believed power only came in a familiar form. That observation became the core of the entire meeting, not because it was provocative, but because it struck at the root of every reaction that followed the incident. The three officers did not act out of ignorance, but because the recognition system they had internalized did not allow them to see the woman standing before them as a general officer, regardless of insignia, encrypted signals, or the look in her eyes that asked for no permission. They did not believe because they could not imagine that the image was real, and that false belief pulled the entire system into a spiral of backlash. At the same time, the Military Justice Committee, normally focused only on internal military matters, formally issued a letter to the Federal Department of Justice requesting prosecution of the three officers involved in the incident under Clause 8.2 for obstructing strategic information and violating military priority rights. The letter used no vague language. It named the three individuals outright, described in detail the handcuffing, communication interference, and continued use of force despite valid warning signals from military devices. Notably, the document emphasized intent, backed by data showing the recording Pentagon line secured had been triggered before the zip ties were tightened. This was no longer an internal investigation request. It was a clear move to shift what seemed like a civilian incident into the realm of national security. The legal consequences of this go far beyond administrative measures. If accepted, the case would be tried in federal court, and sentencing would be based not on physical harm, but on the risk of disrupting strategic information flow, one of the few charges that directly threaten the integrity of the defense system. As soon as news of the prosecution request leaked, legal experts mobilized. Many called it a precedent-setting turn. For the first time in modern history, a group of law enforcement officers faced prosecution for abuse of authority against a military officer while she was performing her duties. It shattered the old mold, where military and law enforcement typically avoided direct confrontation. But this time, every piece of evidence matched, and every data point was clear, and the story was no longer about system failure. It was an open question. When power doesn't look like what you expect, can you still recognize the truth? The system could no longer shield itself in silence. Every next step required a specific response, and when the power once restrained is being restored not through outrage, but through the law she herself authored, then facing the truth is no longer an option. It is the minimum duty of a society that claims to be just. That morning, the sidewalk in front of Federal Courthouse number 12 was packed with reporters. Microphones crowded every frame, cameras ran constant light checks, and broadcast commentators gripped their phones to track every minor development. The entire media presence was there in anticipation of an initial hearing, seen as the first step in a lengthy legal process, where the three officers who once handcuffed Reva Miles would face charges of violating federal law and abusing national security authority. But when the clock struck 8:30, The courthouse's main doors remained ajar. No transport for the defendants arrived, no special security detail appeared, and not a single city officer was in sight. All three individuals involved in the incident failed to show. Instead, a lawyer in a gray suit stepped out from a side entrance, walked straight to the prepared podium, and read a brief statement. "My clients choose not to contest. They will not argue publicly and will not request an open trial." The announcement sent shock through the scene. The press immediately split into two interpretations. Some saw it as a tactic to avoid criminal responsibility by withdrawing from the reaction cycle. Others viewed the coordinated silence from all three as an unspoken admission that any rebuttal at this point would hold no practical value. The public had already reached its own verdict days earlier, and any defense offered now would inevitably be measured against evidence that was already overwhelming. Inside the court, the judges met in private for less than an hour. There was no hearing, no debate over process. The case files were reopened not to re-examine details, but to determine the level of administrative intervention required for a matter that had grown symbolically larger than the system it came from. And by late morning, an official announcement was released from the chamber. The court had approved a combined measure permanently expelling all three individuals from law enforcement, banning them from any future public authority roles, and ordering federal-level restoration of honor for Brigadier General Reva Miles. The action was not carried out through a public trial, but carried full legal weight, backed by documentation from three agencies: the Department of Justice, the Military Justice Committee, and the Office of Administrative Justice Oversight. The phrase "restoration of honor" appeared for the first time in a ruling involving a civil-military conflict, a term the legal field viewed as symbolic, not just to compensate an individual, but to restore their standing within the system they helped build. Some reporters questioned why no criminal charges were pursued. The court responded, "We are not rejecting criminal accountability. We are choosing the path that most directly restores justice, without prolonging harm to the victim and without creating a precedent that turns the law into a political instrument." At the same time, foreign media reported the U.S. has just held a trial without argument because the evidence closed the case on its own. The line echoed through multiple evening broadcasts. The public no longer demanded an apology from the violators. They wanted to see real consequences. And now they had. Quiet, restrained, but firm enough to confirm that every intentional abuse of power leaves a trace in the record, and that trace can return in the form of an administrative ruling, cold and non-negotiable. Reva Miles did not appear in public the day the court announced its decision. She gave no interview, no statement, but when asked why she wasn't present to hear the ruling, a military representative replied simply, "She didn't need to be. The system spoke for her." And in the way it spoke, through action, through its final decision, became clear that some forms of justice do not require a courtroom to exist. They only need to be recognized in time before honor becomes something that must be reclaimed. Here is the accurate and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, all content intact, all numbers written in words, and keeping punctuation consistent without unnecessary line breaks or added embellishment. On the sidewalk across from the courthouse, among the crowd that lingered even after the verdict had been announced, a group of high school students stood in a row, each holding a small wooden sign. On the white background, black letters were printed evenly, not fancy, but direct. She didn't demand justice, she redefined it. The line didn't come from a theorist, a human rights organization, or a seasoned column. It was written by students in an afternoon sociology class, assigned to study the case by their teacher. After reviewing the entire chain of events, they didn't choose outrage, they chose to recognize a quiet transformation where one person, without raising slogans, still caused the system to shift course. The wooden signs remained steady, not raised above heads, not lowered when the news cameras turned their lenses toward them. The students didn't chant, they simply stood, fulfilling their role in an extended lesson. Beside the line of young people people were silent adults. Some were parents, some were veterans, others were simply citizens who came to witness the conclusion of a chain of actions that had made the country reflect on itself. A photojournalist approached to capture a close-up of the signs, then paused at the lower right corner of the frame. There, a young girl held her mother's hand. She looked toward the courthouse, its main doors shut since morning, then looked up and asked, as if the question had been forming in her mind all day, "Is she coming back?" Her mother leaned down and replied without rushing, as if every word needed careful placement. "No need. With every step she took, the system already adjusted itself." That answer wasn't only for the daughter, but for everyone nearby. By that moment, people were no longer looking to the corridors of power for a response. They were watching a new reflex take shape. That steady, consistent presence, without seeking applause, was the most effective way to trigger self-examination in a system that once believed it needed no correction. The photo of the mother and daughter, with the students and their sign redefining justice in the background, later appeared on the front page of a national newspaper. The headline was not bold, just a small line below the image. "Not all leaders stand on a podium. Some stand still and make everything around them move." That caption made the article go viral across online platforms. It touched a feeling many held quietly but hadn't named, the feeling of witnessing a deep change, not born from rebellion but from dignity. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, people left in small groups. No one stayed, hoping for more statements. Everything had been said, through actions, through legal decisions, through the symbolic absence of the person at the center. And in that very silence, each person began to see clearly, when justice is no longer something to be demanded, but becomes a mechanism that adjusts itself in the right direction, then the one who shaped it no longer needs to be present. At the end, the students collected their signs and walked to the waiting bus. One younger boy looked back at the courthouse gates without saying a word. The teacher beside him gently tapped his shoulder, as if to affirm that what he had just learned wasn't in a textbook, but in the way someone had lived, acted, and left behind a principle that needed no repeating. When he perceived justice on that day was not declared. It quietly stood up and kept walking on a path once interrupted, only to reopen in the direction that one person, without speaking loudly, had caused everything to follow. The light in the classroom dimmed as the large screen at the front shifted to a muted frame. The officer cadets sat in neat rows, uniforms crisp, eyes fixed on the slow-moving images. A sequence beginning with 3 uniformed men closing in on a woman standing in a parking lot, her hands behind her back, zip ties tightening, her gaze steady on the camera lens. The footage had been replayed many times in policy classes, yet today no one looked familiar with it. There was something in the repetition that made the room fall completely silent. The instructor stepped out from the left corner, remote in hand, but didn't rush to turn it off. He let the image freeze on the moment Reva Miles lifted her head, the light catching the insignia on her chest. His voice was calm, each word chosen with care, no dramatics. "This is the only case where 3 officers lost their careers without litigation." He paused, eyes scanning the front row, then continued. No trial, no criminal charges, no courtroom confrontation, but every act was recorded, and every action had consequences. Enough for the entire system to re-examine itself. The class remained still. They weren't just hearing about an incident, but facing a situation no standard textbook ever fully described. Reva did not respond the way soldiers are typically trained, not with resistance, not by calling for immediate support. She let it unfold in front of dozens of witnesses. Then let data, law, and justice take over. This wasn't a lesson about power. It was proof of a strategy not taught in any conventional curriculum. A cadet in the 3rd row raised a hand. The question came out hesitant but honest. Did she not react because she was afraid? A few heads tilted slightly, as if sharing the thought but unsure how to voice it. The instructor nodded gently, neither denying nor affirming. He slowly moved toward the whiteboard, his hand brushing the edge of the screen, frozen on Reva Miles's gaze. Sometimes we confuse reaction with strategy. Fear is when you let anxiety drive your behavior. But she stood still, activated the signal, and let the system handle the rest. He turned back, looking directly at the cadet. If you know the signal you send is strong enough to shift an entire structure, you don't need to shout. She didn't react because she had already been activated, and once the system received that signal, the entire chain of authority had to move on its own. The classroom stayed quiet, the atmosphere thick like an emergency response room. The instructor didn't try to stir emotion, he simply analyzed the facts. The issue here isn't about actions. It's about instinct. Those three didn't violate protocol because they lacked tactical training. They violated because they failed to recognize something outside their familiar model, that a black woman could be a general officer. They responded through bias, not procedure, and that's what cost them their positions. That day's session didn't end with a test. It ended with an assignment. Each cadet was to write a personal reflection, ungraded, to be read aloud in the final class. One wrote, "We're taught how to react under threat, but never how to recognize power that comes through silence." Another noted, "I've realized the most important lesson isn't in how to command, but in how to show others they no longer need to be commanded." The class ended, but the image stayed on the screen. No one turned it off right away, because sometimes it's not the answer that creates change, but a gaze held long enough for the learner to understand that some responses don't need to be expressed. They were already set, refined, and precise from the beginning. And that is the highest form of training, the kind that cannot be taught through commands, but through the way someone once handcuffed reshaped the entire system. ChatGPT Denoy. Here is the precise and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, all details intact, no added or omitted content, with minimal punctuation deviations, and all numbers written out as words. The cadet's question still echoed through the room, making the air in the classroom feel heavier than the faint white glow from the fluorescent lights. She didn't react because she was afraid, a question that seemed simple, yet struck at the deepest core of tactical training, where students are often taught how to respond to threats, but rarely taught about the limits of response. The instructor turned back, his eyes calm but focused, as if he had heard the question in his head long before the class began. He walked to the whiteboard, not answering right away, and wrote a single line, the handwriting slanted but firm. "Silence equals not absence, but altitude." After writing, he turned, scanning the room until his gaze stopped exactly where the question had come from. "No," he said. "She didn't react out of fear. She didn't react because she knew real power doesn't need explanation." That answer made the room fall even more silent, not because anyone felt corrected, but because everyone was reevaluating how they had understood the concept of power. In most tactical lessons, officers are taught to control situations, respond by protocol, and minimize risk. But in Riva's case, there was nothing to control. She was the one being controlled, forced against a car, blocked from communicating, restrained with zip tie. Yet with only a glance and one transmitted signal, the entire operational chain above her was forced to readjust. The instructor stepped closer to the screen, where Riva's image remained frozen in a single frame, head slightly raised, badge light reflecting on her cheek, phone below displaying the now widely quoted message, Pentagon line secured. "Do you know what scares a system the most?" he asked slowly, his voice quieter, but every word more distinct. "It's not the scream, it's the presence that says nothing, yet still forces a response, because that kind of presence carries altitude, not volume." The words on the board began to appear in every cadet's notebook. No one was told to write them down, but everyone understood. Silence equals not absence, but absence was not a slogan. It was a new formula for navigating a time when power no longer resides in volume, but in the deeper layers of perception. Another cadet, seated in the back, asked hesitantly, "Then how do we recognize that kind of power if it's never spoken?" The question wasn't naive, it was honest, because most of what people are taught to recognize comes with symbols, commands, and loudly declared authority. The instructor looked to the back of the room, his gaze not critical but understanding. By not letting bias blur the signals, by training yourself to see the depth that others hide, because they don't need to prove anything. He continued, this time not explaining but recalling. That day, 3 people stood less than an arm's length away from her. They saw the badge, heard the signal, and still thought it was fake, because they had never learned that truth doesn't always come in the shape they were taught to call power. They thought power had to be white, male, and announced. They didn't know there's a kind of power so precise that just standing still is enough to make it resonate. By the end of class, the screen had gone dark, and the lights were back on, but no one rushed to leave. The instructor walked out, leaving the whiteboard behind with one line still visible. A single cadet lingered longer than the rest, staring at the words before copying them into the corner of a notebook page. Silence is not absence, it's altitude. That line later became the opening of an essay the cadet submitted for the final tactical exam. The essay was not graded traditionally. It was archived in the internal library, the section reserved for principles no longer found in books, but in the way those who had crossed the threshold chose silence, letting the system speak for itself. In the Tactical Archive of the Federal Strategy Academy, a file once removed from the curriculum for being too abstract was reinstated. It wasn't placed in the general repository, but in a niche section titled Asymmetric Structures, a category reserved for theories that do not operate on traditional reaction-based principles. The document was only 12 pages long, with a silver-gray cover, no hard copy serial number, and a single printed title, Tactical Passive Protocol. The signature at the end of the first page was R. Miles. The date was 15 years ago, when she was still a tactical planning specialist for the Gray Zone Coordination Unit, a force tasked with handling scenarios outside standard battlefield formats, where the boundary between civilian and military became blurred. The document had long been viewed by generations of officers as impractical, since it offered no graded counteraction strategies. Instead, it laid out a doctrine built on silence as an operating system, not surrender, but a structured state, a design that allowed the system to expose its own faults without external force. From the opening section, the document made its premise clear. In situations where the system is misaligned, structured silence is the most effective countermeasure. It could not be applied universally, but under the right conditions, when the operative's authority is revoked based on false assumptions, when any reaction is misread by the system, then maintaining position, allowing the structure to run itself, becomes the way to make the opposing side undermine its own legitimacy. In the accompanying diagrams, she outlined 3 elements required for a passive response to have a strategic effect: clarity of signal, precision in stance, and the capacity to keep emotion from adjusting to conflict. The final section outlined 7 hypothetical scenarios, each requiring no specific action but demanding that the operative understand response lies not in intervention but in letting error surface on its own. The language was not academic but mechanically strategic. She used imagery like a mirror placed correctly, no need for harsh light, still enough to reveal the dark. That note would later be seen by many tactical instructors as the core of Reva Miles' philosophy in advanced training sessions, even though it was never officially included in the standard curriculum. The reemergence of this document, coinciding with an analysis of how Reva responded during the parking lot incident, made clear that it was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a doctrine developed early, tested in overlooked contexts, and only recognized as a model when the world was forced to re-examine the principles of power from an entirely different angle. No warnings, no threats. Yet the system reversed itself, and tracing her conduct, each detail aligned with what was written 15 years prior. A military analyst later wrote in a classified report, "The way she stood was not passive behavior. It was a structure designed to trigger systemic exposure." From that point on, Tactical Passive Protocol was no longer a discarded file. It became foundational material for those who sought to understand that some responses don't function through command, but by placing oneself in exactly the right position, not to act, but to force everything around to recalibrate. At the end of the document, R. Miles had written a single line by hand in black ink, never reproduced in any copy. When others raise their voice, you don't always need to speak back, but if you stay silent the right way, they'll have to find their own voice again. That line did not belong to the military. It belonged to experience. And now, it stands as the bridge between theory and conduct, where a person doesn't proclaim victory, but writes down how to be silent high enough that the system is compelled to look back at itself. Here is the precise and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, all content intact, no added or omitted details, with all numbers written out as words, and punctuation consistent without unnecessary line breaks. In the bottom corner of page 12 of the recently reinstated strategic document, there was a handwritten line in black ink, slightly slanted, not part of the formal layout but seemingly added at the last minute, as the writer closed out the full structure of their doctrine. There was no signature, just a brief sentence. If they do not recognize who is silent, they do not deserve to be heard. The line was not underlined, not bolded, yet it was the one that made readers pause longest, because it carried a principle of stillness, both a boundary and a measure. The first person to notice the note was a cadet tasked with editing next year's training curriculum for the Officer Academy. He didn't know whose handwriting it was, as the copy he received had been stripped of direct attribution. But the way the ink pressed into the paper, the way the word silent was written in one clean stroke with no correction, told him it wasn't an offhand remark. It was the link between strategy and character, where power no longer meant command or mobilization, but the calm to remain intact in the face of a misread reaction. Not long after, during the annual meeting of the Strategic Officer Training Council, the document was brought up again, not as an optional supplement, but proposed for inclusion in the official handbook for the upcoming class. The head of the Curriculum Review Committee asked only one question: what proves the doctrine? The answer didn't come from a trial record or a performance chart, but from the very sequence of events that forced the entire federal investigation system to adjust. Reva Miles' name didn't need to be said aloud. What had happened stood as a full-scale implementation, no counterforce, yet enough to shift the entire structure. The handbook update later assigned a dedicated section to the tactical passive protocol, with a brief annotation to help cadets not just study the theory, but learn to recognize when it should be applied. At the start of that chapter, the handwritten note was also preserved, unchanged, unedited. It marked a first in military documentation, a handwritten sentence included in an official text, a soft principle woven into rigid doctrine. None of the instructors objected. Some even began using it as the opening point in sessions on non-confrontational reflexes. The early discussions around the doctrine were not lively, as it wasn't easy to grasp right away, but gradually, as cadets began asking questions not about the content, but about the consequences, the class deepened. One cadet wrote in a feedback form, "That line isn't just a warning to violators, it's a demand on the one who holds the silence, to be clear enough, right enough, and steady enough for silence to become a real counterweight." The sentence also found its way into off-Howard conversations among cadet groups preparing for field rotations. It was quoted when someone asked, "If we're not trusted from the start, what do we do?" The answer, in the spirit of the doctrine, wasn't to seek validation, but to build until recognition became unavoidable, even without a word. And if it didn't come, the silence still stood as proof, needing no voice to be accepted. In the quiet hallways of the academy at the end of the training season, where cadets often paused to read the quote board, that handwritten note was chosen as the final line of the year. If they do not recognize who is silent, they do not deserve to be heard. It was not a lesson in tactics, but a mirror for both the learner and the one being learned about, to understand that sometimes dignity does not require a statement, only the right stance. And a system, if it still has integrity, will eventually speak for itself. In the Grand Hall of the Federal Strategy Center, the ceremony was formal but understated. On stage stood a single wooden podium, a large screen behind it, and rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the center. There was no orchestra, no colorful spotlighting. Everything remained in neutral tones, just enough for attendees to feel a particular kind of quiet, not from the absence of sound, but from the shared understanding among all present of why they were there. The screen lit up as the ceremony began. It did not show a tribute video or a lengthy list of accomplishments. The chosen image was a single still frame, Reva Miles standing in a familiar setting, light casting a shadow along her shoulders, arms resting at her sides, posture steady. She did not bow her head or turn toward anyone, simply stood straight, her gaze fixed forward as if marking a point for all structures to recalibrate themselves against. There was no display of command, no sign of self-elevation, just a presence with depth enough to require no accompanying gesture. The host stepped out from the wings, voice low and even, offering no long speech but delivering a single prepared line. She doesn't need a medal. She is the standard that is measured. The sentence lacked an emphasized subject, but everyone understood exactly whom it referred to. There was no need to revisit the incident, no need to recount the details that placed Reva Miles in hundreds of internal documents. What earned her this recognition was not any single action, but the way she never sought recognition in the first place. There was no applause immediately after the sentence. A long silence followed, both as respect and as acknowledgement that some individuals need no proclamation, yet still compel institutions to lean in their direction. Her achievements weren't counted by the number of missions commanded or orders issued in crisis. They were counted by how often she chose not to amplify power, but allowed it to function within a framework she had already shaped. And most recently, she didn't stand at the center to be seen. She simply stood still, and the system turned to itself to find where the line truly was. One attendee in the second row, a former cadet from her non-confrontational tactics course, later wrote in a reflection submitted to the organizers, "I used to think rank was proven by the number of commands given, but after learning under her, I understood some people don't need to speak loudly. Just being present is enough for order to realign." That sense spread to many in the room, especially among the younger officers preparing to take command for the first time. They realize that most lessons aren't written in manuals, but are found in the way one person removes their voice so silence can become the only declaration needed. The ceremony ended exactly at the 30-minute mark. There were no personal remarks, no words of thanks from the honoree, and no responses from any representative. On screen, Reva's image remained, but instead of quotes or praise, there was only a simple white line of text below. "Rest is rank." The line offered no explanation. It simply stood as a truth already fulfilled. The rest was not a retreat. It was the moment someone reaches a place where everything around must reset itself. Not by demand, not by effort, not by taking another step. When the last person left the hall, the image on the screen slowly faded. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed, because everyone understood that what was honored that day was not just a person. It was a philosophy of life and work that transcended rank, a philosophy forged by someone who chose to step back, allowing the system itself to grow into the space she left behind. And in that silence, they understood. True authority isn't in taking one more step up, but in knowing when to stop, so everything else must follow. Here is the accurate and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure with no detail omitted, no content added, minimal punctuation, and all numbers written out as words. When the host's final words faded completely, the hall held the same hushed breath it had carried all along. There was no applause, no gestures of praise. The audience remained silent. But that silence was not empty. It had weight. It had focus. The people seated in the room were not asked to rise, yet they stood anyway, unprompted. The hall slowly shifted into a state of stillness, not as a ritual of respect, but as if letting the space itself speak what remained. No one waved, no one spoke. One by one they simply stood, eyes fixed on the large screen, where Reva Miles still appeared, standing tall in the center of the frame, wind brushing her coat on some long-past day. In that moment, no one cared about rank, commendations, or service records. What they held on to was a posture that had never tilted, not under media glare, not under restraints, not under the distortion of first impressions. Outside the hall, the wind had picked up. The first summer breeze slid through the thick glass panes, not loud enough to make a sound, but just enough to make the curtains shift slightly, like a shared rhythm. That breeze didn't move everything. It made stillness meaningful, and in that moment, a line appeared on the screen. No effects, no music, just lit plainly against a deep black background. General Reva Miles, rank, still standing. The line stayed longer than usual, as if designed not to pass through but to remain in the viewer's memory. No capital emphasis, no exclamation mark, just a quiet statement, and because of that it carried more weight. It didn't define rank by administrative terms, it wasn't measured by years served or number of promotions. Still standing wasn't just physical, it was the final acknowledgement of someone who had once been forced down onto a car hood, but never lost her own height. A young officer standing at the back of the hall lightly held a folded copy of his notes. He looked at the line as if it confirmed the path he'd chosen, not for glory or title, but for the chance to stand centered in conflict without shifting. In that moment, the words were no longer about Reva. They became a measure for anyone who had ever seen a system go wrong, that one doesn't need to strike back or speak immediately, but must be steady enough to remain whole through it all. In other corners of the hall, many had not yet left. There was no closing announcement, no exit music. Everything was left open, as if each attendee had the right to finish their experience in their own way. Some closed their eyes, some took notes, some just stood there, doing nothing, in the same way Reva once had, quietly, without bending to public noise, but also without retreating even half a step in the face of naked bias. Hours after the ceremony ended, an image of the screen with the words "still standing" began circulating on social media. It needed no explanation. Those who had followed the case understood. Those who hadn't needed to read the entire story to feel the weight behind those 3 words. There was something beyond literal meaning, as if everyone recognized a person still standing, after everything around them had once cracked, no longer needed to say anything. And perhaps that is the highest rank anyone could hope to reach, not through authority, but through never letting go of dignity when every eye is on you. The words remained lit as the hall slowly emptied. No one turned them off. No one needed to. Because sometimes a sentence belongs exactly where and when it appears, to remind everyone that silence does not lessen value, and stillness is not erasure. It can be the ultimate form of presence. And there, General Reva Miles, though absent, remained fully present, rank still standing. At a prestigious military academy east of the capital, the strategy classroom was renamed after months of discussion, not to honor a battlefield legend, nor to commemorate a successful campaign, but to mark a principle that had surpassed all traditional frameworks. The brass plaque at the entrance now reads, Reva M. Strategy Room. No rank listed, no description added, because for those who have taught and learned here, those 3 words alone evoke the full depth of a leadership philosophy that changed the system. Since the renaming, the room has carried a quieter atmosphere, not from tension, but from the sense that everyone entering bears a different layer of responsibility. On each door leading into the classroom, a new motto is posted in uniform fashion, white background, bold black lettering, no italics. Don't count the times you gave orders. Remember the last time you said nothing and everyone stepped back. The line didn't come from a formal speech or a declaration by a high-ranking officer. It was taken from the handwritten notes of a graduating cadet, someone who had witnessed the incident that year and later returned as an instructor. He wrote it in the margin of his notebook after the ceremony honoring General Reva Miles. Almost instinctively, the phrase quietly spread among Academy staff, and when the renaming was approved, It was chosen as the signature, less for rhetoric, more for its cold, exact truth. In an afternoon class, soft light passed through a thin curtain, and the young instructor's voice carried evenly through the room. He had served briefly on the front lines before turning to non-confrontational strategy research. Standing at the front with no notes in hand, eyes meeting the cadets, he said, "Power isn't in the gun." Slowly, not for drama, but to let each word land. It's in her eyes when she was cuffed and still a general. No one took notes right away. Many simply looked at the screen, where the frame remained still. Reva Miles surrounded, head unbowed, light cutting across her at an angle. The instructor added nothing else, because the lesson wasn't in analysis, but in each student recognizing for themselves what made someone who didn't fight back cause the entire system to stop. He continued, "You'll learn how to give commands, but later what will keep your position won't be your voice. It will be the consistency that makes your presence alone enough to stop what's wrong from continuing." The cadets began responding with private notes. One wrote, "I used to think strategy meant acting first, explaining later. Now I understand. Sometimes doing nothing is the only move that leaves the other side unable to recover." Another wrote, "I never imagined someone with restrained hands could preserve order just by not shifting their gaze." The Reva Mem Strategy Room later became a familiar destination for cadets seeking out tactical materials. In the days leading up to exams, many chose to sit quietly there, not to study more, but to reconnect with the core principle inscribed into every edge of the room, that response doesn't always come from force, but from the depth of character. In an internal staff exchange, a longtime instructor remarked, "We used to train cadets to confront, but from now on we'll train them to know when to stand still, because not everyone can be steady enough to choose stillness and still make the system step back. No statue needed, no medals displayed, just keep the room name." Because what happened wasn't just a lesson, it was a new structure for how we understand power. And in that place, each day reminds a generation that some led not by voice, but by a silence that made every boundary clearer than ever before. Here is the accurate and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, all content intact, no added or omitted details, with all numbers written out as words, punctuation consistent, and no unnecessary line breaks. The photograph, displayed prominently on the front wall of the Reva M Strategy Room, carries no caption, no date, and no descriptive note. In a dark wooden frame beneath a thin glass pane, the black and white image captures Reva Miles holding a phone that had fallen beside a vehicle, the screen's glow reflecting against her hand, with a single clear line of text. Pentagon line secured. No one knows exactly who took the photo. It may have been a still from a circulated video or a close-up from an unreleased source. But somehow, that moment was preserved, carefully framed, and placed in a position impossible to miss when entering the classroom. Everyone who passes sees it. No one adds a comment, and none is needed. The image completes a story that reshaped an entire system. The reflection from the phone screen in the photo isn't bright, but it's strong enough to draw the eye. That line of text, once spread across countless platforms, no longer stands as a symbol of top-level authority, but as an emblem of silent affirmation. It isn't a warning, it is a confirmation that the call was connected, the identity confirmed. And from that point on, the system had to recognize its own error. No one at the academy is ever asked to explain the photo in class. Instructors don't weave it into lectures, as if any analysis would dull the fullness of the moment. Those who understand already do. Those who don't, in time, come to realize that some messages don't need to be read aloud. They only need to be present at the right place at the right time, and steady enough that no one can ignore them. Amid the constant flow of schedules, documents, assignments, and the pressure of training, there are moments when cadets pause before that frame. No one takes pictures, no one starts debates. Each person engages in their own way, then walks on quietly. Some give a subtle nod, some jot a line in their notebook, as if to hold on to something that defies articulation, and though no words are exchanged, all carry the same impression. The photo does not refer to rank or record. It recalls a moment when dignity did not step back, even as the circumstances demanded it bow. A longtime instructor once remarked in a faculty meeting, "The value of that image isn't in the subject, but in how the system saw itself reflected in a moment it didn't believe could be real." And in every class thereafter, as students entered and glanced at the photo, there was no need to revisit the incident. The faint light from the phone screen did its part as a symbol. No guidance was necessary. Everyone understood. At the end of each term, when cadets graduate, they're not required to recite every doctrine, but most say there's one thing not on the test, not in the syllabus, that stays with them: the silence of one person in the middle of conflict, and how the words "Pentagon line secured" weren't just a signal from a call, but a final confirmation of that person's position, principle, and dignity. No medal needed, no statue. One small frame, one short line, and one quiet room are enough to hold what matters most. The recognition that some forms of power ask for no acknowledgement, but once they appear, the entire system can no longer return to what it was. And sometimes that is all it takes. A glow from a screen, cast in silence, enough to make an institution take one step back. Here is the accurate and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, with no detail omitted, no content added, all numbers written out as words, and punctuation consistent without unnecessary line breaks. On a mild afternoon, soft wind passed through the memorial grounds behind the Strategy Academy. There was no grand monument, no marble column raised as a symbol of authority, just a small, stone-paved square with a bronze plaque set low to the ground between 2 rows of trees. On the plaque were 8 words, unadorned and direct. 1 call, 3 careers, a new standard. At the edge of the memorial, a young girl around 8 years old walked by, holding 2 of her father's fingers. She didn't skip or run like children usually do. Her eyes lingered on the plaque, tracing each word as if they might translate something deeper than their meaning. She turned to her father and asked quietly but clearly, was she angry? The father looked at her for a long moment. He didn't answer right away. It wasn't a question meant for quick reply. It needed a pause to understand what it truly asked. Then he slowly shook his head, still looking forward, toward the words catching the sunset's light. No, she wasn't angry. She proved it. The answer made the girl go quiet, but her eyes stayed fixed on the plaque. She didn't ask another question, but her gaze seemed to process something beyond her age, something likely to stay longer than any lesson in class. The father didn't explain further. In that moment, he let the silence carry the rest, because sometimes the most lasting truths have to be absorbed slowly, not reasoned out. Years later, she may forget which day that afternoon was, whether it was windy or what color shoes she wore, but those 8 words and her father's reply may become a starting point for choices to come. When she stands at the line between reaction and proof, between anger and dignity, between speaking to confront and choosing silence so the system can see itself, that memorial has no guard. No one is required to stop. It sits quietly in the daily landscape, part of the grounds, by design, and for that reason everyone who pauses there does so in their own way. Some read it silently, some take a photo, some walk past and look up slowly, but each leaves with a trace of awareness, as if the place doesn't just remember a past act, it marks a point where the system learned to relearn itself. The message doesn't call for revenge, nor raise statues in praise. It simply reminds that one person once made the right call, and from that moment, the structure of power had to redefine how it functions. No need for repetition, no need for expansion. One act made at the right time, preserved not for its tension, but for its stillness, so deep that it forced the opposing side to change the very scale it used to measure presence. Experience proved it. That sentence became the final note in a wordless composition, echoing after a series of events no one had predicted. And for generations to come, it will be remembered not for drama, but but for silent conviction, the kind that shows some calls don't need to be loud, but what's heard afterward never fades. That girl, on that afternoon, may not have grasped the full weight of the woman being remembered, but her long pause in front of those words was already a sign. Each generation will inherit this lesson, not through lectures, but through the way one quiet act once made a system speak from within. And if the question, "Was she angry?" is ever asked, the answer will always be no. She stood still, and everything else began to change. Here is the precise and concise American English translation, preserving the original 5-paragraph structure, all content intact, with no added or omitted details, punctuation consistent, and all numbers written out as words. Not far from the memorial plaque bearing the line that became a national quote, an old patch of concrete was left untouched, not polished, not replaced, and not inscribed with anything except one solitary detail. 2 faint impressions of handcuffs. They aren't sharply carved, nor cast in raised relief. The shallow marks are just deep enough to catch the slant of light, showing the outline of 2 slightly misaligned circles, smaller than an adult wrist, with a groove trailing behind, as if the imprint had once struggled before coming to a halt. No one knows exactly who chose to preserve that section. Some say it was suggested by a group of former cadets. Others claim the Department of Defense submitted the request to retain the original scene as a silent witness. But everyone knows the marks are real, pressed into the ground that afternoon when a general officer was forced to crouch under the weight of prejudice. Just beneath the indentations is a small line of text, not centered but slightly offset to the left, as if leaving space for the viewer's gaze to continue forward. No one needs to shout to be heard. Just stand still long enough and the system will fall quiet. The line is familiar. It once appeared in the Recovered Strategy Training Manual based on Riva Miles's doctrine, originally handwritten in the margins. But, placed now beneath the cuffs, it takes on a different meaning. It is no longer theory, no longer a behavioral principle. It becomes a test, a way to measure the reaction of those who pass by. Anyone who pauses longer than a few seconds will understand this is more than a symbol. It is physical evidence that a person can be brought low in posture, yet remain elevated in the way the system must shift around them. Some have crouched beside the marks, placing a hand near the edge to sense a certain weight, not from the concrete, but from the memory pressed into it. No one cries, no one speaks loudly, yet many share the same gesture, a subtle step back after reading the quote, as if the words had just reflected something inward. Because, in the end, not everyone is brave enough to stay still while being misjudged and still hold to their principle. The line does not sit there to speak about Riva, it sits there to challenge each person who walks past. For those trying too hard to be heard, the words may sting like irony. For those who've held firm without raising their voice, it reads like a quiet mirror of their chosen path. And among them are children, like the girl who once asked her father about anger, now grown into a new generation, passing by the cuffs and understanding that some marks are left not from pain, but because in their silence, truth remains whole. The memorial has never changed since the day it was finished. No added flowers, no background lighting, no protective canopy. The handcuff marks remain, through sun, through rain, through every holiday season without fading. No one polishes them, no one covers them, and it's precisely because they sit bare in the open stone that their contrast is clearest. An act once meant to diminish dignity now serves as a model for power that knows how to be silent without yielding. When the sun tilts westward, the light casts a narrow shadow from the cuff marks across the line of text. No one programmed that effect. It happens at just 1 hour each day, like an unscheduled reminder. And when it does, no recording is needed, no broadcast. Just one person pausing, reading all 8 words on the ground, and letting themselves admit, somewhere, someone once didn't need to shout to be heard. But from that moment, the system had to learn how to listen. The story began on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon in a city parking lot, where 3 white police officers approached a black woman in military uniform. They didn't look closely at her insignia, didn't reassess the situation, but immediately triggered a full response, driven by mockery and force, like a reflex born from the habit of unchecked power. A joke, a tug on the arm, a shove against the hood, a tightening of zip ties, all executed within minutes, too quickly for the system to remind them that sometimes what they're suppressing may be the very order they're sworn to uphold. They didn't realize the woman was Brigadier General Reva Miles. They didn't notice that even as her hands were locked behind her back, her eyes remained fixed on the lens of a nearby phone. And when the screen lit up with the words "Pentagon line secured," the system they served was no longer in control. From that moment on, every move became a passive reaction to a single act. She had stood still. There was no shouting, no violent resistance. She didn't argue or invoke her rank. Everything unfolded within the bounds of decorum, and for that reason, the system could offer no legitimate excuse. Every choice she made served as a test of perception, from the unwavering gaze to the single touch on a phone that reset the entire dynamic. And then sitting still, restrained, yet carrying the weight of command. From the first video posted online to the leaks of internal documents, the incident didn't evolve into a typical media crisis. It became a seismic shift in thinking about power, response, and justice. Reva didn't knock anyone down, but the 3 officers tripped over themselves, turning their abuse into a symbol. They didn't lose their jobs over a procedural error. They lost all standing because they failed to recognize silent authority when it was right in front of them. The investigation that followed wasn't for revenge. It was to restore the principle. Security units, military forces, strategic academies, and administrative courts were not overwhelmed. They were simply required to do what a functioning system should: listen when the truth isn't screaming. The statement, "I don't need to use force when truth can prove itself," was recorded in the official debrief not as a declaration, but as a new tool for monitoring power itself. From being restrained beside a vehicle, she became the architect of a new tactical training method. No lawsuits, no retaliation. She didn't speak on television or capitalize on notoriety to amplify her voice. Everything she needed to say was already present in the way she held her posture in a single frame. And that's why her image now hangs in academies, her name etched on strategy rooms, and the doctrine she wrote 15 years ago is included in training handbooks under the name Tactical Passive Protocol. What's remarkable is that no statue was erected for her. Instead, one line was etched into an old patch of concrete, just below the deliberately preserved handcuff marks. No one needs to shout to be heard. Just stand still long enough, and the system will fall quiet. It's not a philosophy, it's a measure. If you must shout to be heard, you are operating in a space that lacks empathy. But if you can remain still and still prompt others to adjust, then that silence is the highest rank power can attain. The lesson isn't inspiring because she was a general. It's powerful because she used the right conditions to create change without breaking order. Reva Miles didn't redefine power through title. She redefined it by refusing to use it as a weapon. And that is what forced the system to restructure. Not because she demanded it, but because her presence made avoidance impossible. The story didn't close with a courtroom or a ceremony. It ended when a young girl paused at a memorial and asked her father if the woman had ever been angry. And the father replied, "She wasn't angry, she proved." From there, the story was no longer just a series of events. It became an ethical legacy for future generations to understand that some silences are not weakness, some retreats are not defeat. And if a system once ran on loud voices, it must now relearn how to listen from someone who only had to speak once, but was heard forever.